Ladies and gentlemen, or actually should I say brothers and sisters, we're here as a human family. We're talking about human rights, and my religion says that the entire human race is one. I'm a Sikh, and I'm coming to you today to present a Sikh perspective. I'm going to interrupt my address for 1 second. I don't know if the organisers can remove that flag. I don't associate myself. I do not associate myself with India at all. India is committing crimes against international law in Kashmir. India has committed crimes against my people in Punjab, in the Sikh homeland, and that is something that it couldn't be further from the truth. I represent the World Sikh Parliament. The World Sikh Parliament was set up to represent the Sikhs as a nation on the world stage. The Sikhs are a nation. We are a nation without a state, but nevertheless we're a nation. And the Sikhs have struggled for self-determination in the form of an independent state in Indian-occupied Punjab for many, many decades. And it's actually that background that allows me to come to you today and present evidence. I'm a lawyer, so I tend to deal with evidence. I tend to try to support arguments with some kind of substantive, factual background to convince the people I'm talking to. Now, the evidence of Punjab and my people's struggle for self-determination, which was essentially throughout the 1980s and the 1990s, was that the Indian state used brutal force, which amounted to genocide. An estimated 200,000 Sikhs were killed during that 2-decade period in order to crush the Sikh struggle for self-determination. Now remember, the Sikh homeland of Punjab is next door. It is literally next door to Kashmir. The Kashmiris are our neighbours. So there's a lot of common ground between what happened to us and what is happening to them. So the first thing I will say about that similarity is that the genocide experienced by the Sikhs at the hands of the Indian state, I predict that the genocide will be visited on the Kashmiris unless we act. I also predict, as has happened in the case of the Punjab, that the Indian state will cover up what they're doing. So we've had 108 days now of lockdown. What's the purpose of a lockdown? What's the purpose of preventing the media having access? What's the purpose of shutting off the internet? I don't buy the Indian argument that this is about controlling the Kashmiris and putting them in their prison. Yes, that's part of what they're doing, but probably just as important is they are stopping the eyes and the ears of the world seeing and hearing what they are doing in Kashmir. And it is my firm belief that unless the Kashmiris surrender, and they shouldn't surrender, and from what I've heard of Kashmiris here today and over recent months and years, they won't surrender. They have a right under international law, the right of self-determination. That right is not something that the odd international lawyer has come up with. That right is supported, again, by evidence. We've heard about United Nations Security Council resolutions promoting a plebiscite, which is essentially the tool through which you deliver self-determination. 2 reports from the UN High Commission on Human Rights over the last 12 months have expressly referred to the right of self-determination of the Kashmiris, and that must be respected. So fundamentally, again, similar to the Punjab situation, we're talking about the right of self-determination. And on a legal perspective, let me tell you how India stands on the right of self-determination. The right of self-determination is referred to in the UN Charter. It's also referred to in Article 1 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, 1966. That document, which became the bedrock of humanitarian law, that document was meant to, in effect, legislate on the international arena for human rights. And the right of self-determination, it wasn't tucked away on page 20 or page 30 or Article 50. The right of self-determination was given pride of place in Article 1. Now, when India signed up to the 1966 Covenant, it did something fairly remarkable. So it said, we accept this, we'll accede to this treaty. And then they, at the very same time, simultaneously entered a reservation saying Article 1 does not apply to India. So how can the international community accept that as a credible position? It can't, and it hadn't. So the UN's Human Rights Committee, which is a committee of international lawyers set up to monitor compliance with the 1966 Covenant, the Human Rights Committee asked India to withdraw that reservation, and they have not done so. Interestingly, several states also, this is fairly unusual, told India that this reservation is unacceptable. The Netherlands, France, Germany, and more recently Pakistan has said this reservation does not stand up to scrutiny. It goes against the very concept of that Article 1, which is the right of self-determination. I'm going to mention a couple of other, time is obviously an issue today because we're running late. I'm going to mention another couple of legal issues or legal concepts that are relevant to Kashmir. There's the Genocide Convention, 1948. India has signed the Genocide Convention. Now, the Genocide Convention obviously prohibits genocide and obviously requires states to take action against people who perpetrate genocide. So, what the Genocide Convention also says is that states must enact domestic legislation to bring the Genocide Convention 1948 into practice at the domestic level, so that people who carry out genocidal acts can be tried, prosecuted, and punished for the crime of genocide. Now, during the 1980s and the early 1990s, as I've said, genocide was carried out against the Sikhs in Punjab. Genocide was also carried out against the Muslims in Narendra Modi's own backyard, the state of Gujarat. And has anybody been acted upon? Has anybody been pursued for the crime of genocide? No. You will find the odd trial for murder. You will find the odd trial for criminal disorder, for rioting. You won't find a crime punished or even punishable for genocide. And I'm saying to you, as somebody who has come through this period and experienced what India does and how it plays these games, India uses genocide as an instrument of state policy. It's used it before, and my fear is it will use it again. Kashmir is being lined up for a bloodbath. We've seen it before, and we'll see it again. We're talking about the BJP, which is a fascist party. Let's not mince words. Let's not talk about extremism and right-wingism and, oppressing minorities. Let's call it what it is. These people, in their ideological history, praised the Nazis. They looked up to them. They've modelled their organisation on how the Nazis worked. And that's exactly what they're doing now. The blueprint they have got to Hinduize Kashmir, democratic change will result from the revocation of Article 370 and Article 35A. The Muslim majority will be diluted. Just last week, the Babri Masjid case. Maybe some of our friends here in Turkey might not know too much about the Babri Masjid, but it was a mosque, 500-year-old mosque, which was torn down by Hindu extremists in the 1990s. They want to build a Hindu temple on the spot, on the very spot. So the Supreme Court last week gave the final verdict. And the verdict was that the Muslims can go away and have 5 acres of land somewhere down the road. Don't care, doesn't matter. And the Hindus can build their Hindu temple on the spot of the mosque that was destroyed by these extremists. So we are talking about a fascist state, and I don't want us to underestimate that. Finally, we talk about what to do in terms of action. The international community has a responsibility. In 2005, the United Nations passed, admittedly, it's a principle more than a law, one would argue. But it adopted the principle of the responsibility to protect. And that was adopted for exactly this scenario, where there is an anticipation or a perception that a population can be subject to war crimes and atrocities, including genocide. So I would suggest that the international community should stop playing around with diplomatic posturing. There is, on the UN statute book, there is a principle that allows intervention. I'm not suggesting that should be militarily intervention straight away. It may get to that. If we have to protect the lives of innocent Kashmiris, defenseless civilians, by force, the international community must be allowed to do that, ultimately, if that becomes necessary. But in the meantime, sanctions can be imposed. People within that regime can be targeted by sanctions. The country can be targeted by sanctions. It must be brought to the diplomatic table. It must recognize its responsibilities under international law. So that's what I'm asking the international community to do, to exercise a duty, not a right, a duty, a responsibility to protect. So what do we do? What do we do as individuals? A lot of you are from various places in the world. I'm from the UK. There are some 2 million-ish, approximately, Sikhs and Muslims and Kashmiris taken together in the UK. So there's a general election coming up in the UK in a few days' time, on 12th of December. It's a very closely fought general election. Many of you across the world will have followed the shambles that the UK has gone through over Brexit. And it's because of the Brexit shambles that a general election became necessary. But a general election is taking place. And I am working with my friends in the Kashmiri community, across the Sikh community, and anybody else who's got a conscience and who wants to support us, to approach all the candidates in that election, it doesn't matter which party they belong to, and ask them to support our request to intervene to stop a calamity in South Asia which could end up in a nuclear catastrophe, which costs tens of millions of lives. And in addition to that intervention, to promote the idea that ultimate enduring peace in South Asia can only be achieved through the right of self-determination, both in Kashmir and in neighboring Punjab, so that entire region, we've heard reference to Bill Clinton's comments that this was the most dangerous place on the planet. That entire region needs fixing. And the only tool that I've heard, not just here today, but over the recent past months, the only tool, the only roadmap that makes any sense is you deliver the right of self-determination in Kashmir and in adjoining Punjab. We defuse the tensions. We separate these nuclear powers, physically separate them. Instead of shooting over the border, line of control, casualties, every day they are casualties. We stop this once and for all. That's the solution. There's a responsibility to protect for the international community, and I say to you all, there's a responsibility on us individually to change the narrative, to get out there, get the international community to understand the core issue, It's the right of self-determination. Once that is implemented, South Asia can get the peace and justice it deserves. Thank you.